it and we'll do a little review because you guys know how much I love reviews, and we'll get this show on the road. So let's see off the top of my head what I can do for a review for us. Okay, so I think this is where we left off. We were talking about hydras. So let's jump back to, let's see, who can tell me the name of the hard crystallized structures that are made by amoebocytes that are like basically the 2x4s that hold up a house for a sponge? What are the crystallized structures that make a sponge strong? Anybody want to guess? Starts with the letter S. You raise your hand, type in the chat box. Spicules. Got it. Good job. Good job. All right, let's see. Who can tell me the cells that capture food? As the flagella generate the current, there's a little mucus-lined cell in that sponge. It catches food. What's that thing called?
Isn't it like a weird name?
Like a thing goes around a dog's neck?
Collar.
Yes, like a collar cell? Yes, it is like a collar cell. Good job. Good job. Let's see. What else do we talk about? Oh, I got a good one. All right. In the phylum Cnidarians, if you have an animal who is anchored to the ocean floor and its little tentacles are pointing straight up trying to catch food, is that a polyp or a medusa? Don, what do you think?
Medusa.
Oh, you're so close. Remember, Medusa's hangs down like all the snakes off the lady's hair. So they're kind of swimming like this with the tentacles hanging down. So it'd be a polyp. That's a good guess, though. Let's see. How else should we do this? What else could I ask you? Oh, I got a good one. Okay. What do you call the layer of tissues in a hydra that conduct impulses for it to sense its environment and move? There's a whole layer. What do you call that whole layer of cells? Don, give it a guess.
Nerve net.
Ooh, good answer. Good answer. All right. What do you call the equivalent of a stomach in a hydra? Our stomach is a bag that holds our food.
Gastrovascular cavity.
Got him. Good guess. Was that Thomas who said that?
Yes.
Good job, Thomas. That's a real good guess. Good guess. All right. So what is the tissue that lines the gastrovascular cavity then? Anybody want to give that one a shot? Lauren wants to give that a shot. What's that?
Is it the gastrodermis?
Good answer. And on just about every critter, including us, we've had an outside layer of essentially, between friends, skin. What is the term for that skin pretty much always called?
Epidermis.
Mm-hmm. It was real quiet, but somebody said epidermis, so good answer. All right, cool. Good job, guys. Good review. I like those little reviews, especially, since we're not doing death by worksheet, we got to throw some reviews in there, which I really am a fan of that. So, hydra reproduction. We said that hydra, like so many other little animals, are successful because they can do both asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. When conditions are good, you make your clones, you take over the pond. When winter comes and conditions are getting a little sketchy, you go through sexual reproduction for diversity, and you let those little babies hibernate until the winter. Yes, Doug, I agree. Hydra is very cool. Okay, so then what you end up getting is a very good reproductive strategy for those hydra. The zygote protects itself, hibernates, hatches in the spring, goes through asexual reproduction, and can populate very, very quickly, which is a huge advantage to that hydra. All right, so let's talk about jellyfish. Jellyfish are a whole lot cooler looking, in my opinion, than a hydra is. And they exist in two phases. One is a polyp, when they're little tiny jellyfish, and the second is a medusa. And last time we watched a video on the immortal jellyfish, which when it gets diseased or threatened or stressed, will actually turn back into a polyp. It'll just turn back into a baby. So nobody really knows how old it is, because every time you get old or sick, you turn into a baby, you could potentially live forever. So they are going to catch food. We watched them catch food last time with their little tentacles. They have a nerve net. They have a gastrovascular cavity to put their food in. A lot of these things are very similar to the hydra, but the reproduction is a little bit different. The male will release free swimming sperm into the sea. And those sperm will have to swim into the gastrovascular cavity of a female jellyfish, because bear in mind, these guys only have one opening. So food, waste, reproduction, it kind of all has to go on in the gastrovascular cavity, because that's the only opening in their simple little bodies. They'll have ova in there. They'll fertilize those ova. And that just is plural for eggs. And so any animal that makes eggs is ova, is plural. Ovum is singular. Ovulation, to release eggs, those kinds of things. So when you see that, that's what that means. The zygote is going to develop in mom, which is cool because that's different than what we've seen so far in the very simple animals that we've looked at. And that zygote will kind of be safe inside mom's gastrovascular cavity for a while. And then as it gets larger, it will swim out and cling to these arms right by mom's mouth. That little zygote will just kind of cling on, and he's got little tiny legs, and when he's ready to, he can swim away. And so little ciliated larva, we could try to throw some little legs on this guy, and he'll swim away, and he will go plant himself on the ocean floor as a polyp, which is kind of cool. And we've already watched him eat something. So here's a really good picture of the life cycle. So here we've got this little ciliated larva. He's called a planula. You don't have to memorize that, but he swims away from mom, and he plants himself on the ocean floor, coral reef, or sand, or wherever. And he plants himself, and he becomes a polyp, which is cool because he's going to look a lot like a hydra. We've still got a gastrovascular cavity. We've still got a mouth or an anus. We've still got tentacles, like you've seen this body plan before. He's going to catch little tiny food particles and put them into his mouth, just like the hydra does. But when he grows up, something weird's going to happen. He's going to start to produce buds. And buds will come off of this guy. Multiple buds, right, will come off of this same polyp. And those buds will swim away and become an immature medusa. And they literally turn kind of inside out to make this bell shape here. And then these guys here will become longer, more defined functional tentacles. And he'll be an adult jellyfish again, which is kind of a cool, kind of a weird, it's a weird way to grow up compared to like what you guys have seen. Like you've probably seen puppies grow up, cats grow up, baby robins in a nest outside grow up, that kind of stuff. But not too many critters that you and I are familiar with will plant themselves and then produce many copies of themselves as adults. That's a little weird. So definitely a cool life cycle on that. Anybody got any questions on jellyfish, nutrition, movement, responsive stimuli, reproduction, any of that stuff? Or you feel okay about it? Cool. That's good, because you guys know I don't know a whole lot about the ocean, so I probably wouldn't be able to answer it. So that's really cool, though. All right, so let's talk about anthozoa. You do not have to spell anthozoa correctly, but anthozoa, we're going to look at our polyps. These are the guys who are stuck to the ocean floor, and there's a couple types of them. There's corals and there's anemones. Corals are probably more famous than anemones are. Corals are very famous because they have this real bad thing going on called coral bleaching. Coral reefs are very colorful, beautiful places. They're incredibly biologically diverse. They house many, 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 many species, and generally speaking, they are close to shore. And even though the ocean is a very large place, the vast majority of ocean life occurs within a few miles of shorelines, and that's where the coral lives, and that's where most of the plankton and mosses live, and that's where most of the biodiversity is. And coral is tricky because it's hard like a rock, and it can cut up people and cut up boats. It's hard like a rock, but the thing is, this top layer of coral's alive, right? And it's built on a lower layer of coral skeletons that are dead, and a lower layer of skeletons below those that are dead. And so coral's a little bit tricky because it looks like a rock, but that stuff is very much so alive. And if ocean currents become very, very hot, it'll kill the coral, and all the pink, yellow, and blue stuff will just turn white. And what you're left with is the skeletonized shell of the coral with no living polyp inside. And the tricky part about this is these guys grow super slow. and they'll die in just a couple of weeks. So you can kill them real quick, but it takes a long, long time for them to grow back. And so people get real worked up about coral bleaching. Sometimes real warm ocean currents will kill them. And some folks get real amped up about global warming and those kinds of things. Sometimes nitrogen runoff from large-scale agriculture will kill them. You know, nitrates and phosphates will pollute the water and kill them that way. Other forms of pollution that we probably haven't identified, you know, near urban centers will kill them. And so coral is important because it's alive and it's also habitat. And it's also apparently fragile. Some of the biggest coral reef kill-offs have happened while you guys have been alive, really in the last few years. So it's kind of, I guess, I don't know if the word is cool or sad or whatever, but it's really something. So anyways, Anthozoa does mean flower animals, not something you need to memorize. But a coral is a little teeny tiny polyp, and that polyp lives in a stone skeleton or cup. And the stone skeleton's really cool because when fish cruise around or sea turtles or whatever's going to eat this coral, they've got the ability to kind of suck down in and hide inside that polyp. And you guys all saw The Little Mermaid when you were growing up, didn't you? That movie was around. Okay, there's this, you know, she like swims by these things, and as she swims by, they've all got like their little feelers out, and they just and they like suck themselves down into their cups for protection. That's kind of the idea we're looking at with coral polyps. It's pretty cool. So when they want to catch food, they come up out of that cup and try to catch food, and when they want to hide, they hide in their little stone cup. Now, the sad thing about this is when you can't move, you're eventually going to get buried by your kids and your grandkids and your great grandkids because they end up sticking together and forming these colonies, one on top of the other. And eventually you will get other baby coral stuck on you, right? All over the place. And they're going to start growing off of you real slow. And eventually you can't get out of your stone cup to feed. Those babies are taking over using your stone cup as a place to land. And so what you'll end up doing is you'll kill and bury that bottom layer coral and replace it with a new generation on top. And that's how you end up building these reefs over time, which is kind of cool, but kind of weird too. So only the top layer of that coral is alive. But of course, it's a great place for little fishies to hide and live. And so the biodiversity in and around coral reefs is huge. We have made some really big strides in saving coral reefs because we found we can break chunks off and plant them and actually regrow coral reefs. And in a lot of developing countries, you know, if you overfish the coral reef and pollute the coral reef, you can kill it. But if you take care of the coral reef and get tourists to come and scuba dive in it, you can make more money than you might be doing the activities that can pollute it. So to some extent, the coral reef might be able to save itself if you know, folks are utilizing it for tourism, which kind of hard when folks aren't really flying internationally, but you know, same thing. So let's see, I think we've already seen that video with the coral reef. Okay, let's talk about sea anemones. Everybody knows sea anemones from Finding Nemo, right? He's like, "What do you live in, kid?" And he's like, "Anemone, anemone, don't hurt yourself." You know, everybody knows that movie. So sea anemones are, of course, a polyp. They're quite a lot larger than corals, generally speaking. They have to anchor themselves on some sort of underwater, you know, rock or debris or whatever. Then they grow up as a pretty large polyp, actually. They're going to work the same way where they have little nematocysts, which sting things, just like the hydra did. They have one hole for a mouth and anus, just like the hydra did. They have one gastrovascular cavity to shove all their food in, just like the hydra did. So I know that like the hydra is so boring. When you learn the hydra, you're like, man, this is a super boring thing. But then you see like all these body plans that operate in such a similar way. And it's like, oh, it's kind of cool. It's, you know, you learn one and it's really not a huge jump to get the rest of them figured out. So big old polyp, lots of tentacles, and paralyzing cells that will sting and eat little tiny fishes, except for Nemo. It doesn't sting and eat Nemo. You know why? Anybody know the answer? Oh, sorry, Don.
Does uh, the fish produce some chemical to protect it from the stinging?
That's a really good guess. That's a super good guess. Do you remember what Nemo's dad makes him do before he goes to school? What's he have him do? Aubrey's giving me sign language for brush your teeth. He's like, brush yourself. And he's like, no. He's like, do you want this sea anemone to sting you? And he's like, yes, because he's just being naughty. Well, my understanding of it, which bear in mind, I'm afraid of the ocean and everything in it, but basically when those clownfish get in there and rub themselves all over the base of that polyp, they are coating their skin cells, their scales, right, with cells that they're sloughing off of that anemone. So the anemone doesn't sting itself. So when it feels that fish with its tentacles, it's feeling its own cells. So there's nothing to sting. Does that kind of make sense? So it's cool because now it's like living inside an electric fence, like who's going to mess with you? This is awesome. So that's a pretty cool relationship, which we know is mutualism. Hi, Avery. How are you? Did you just jump in here or did I totally miss saying hi to you earlier?
No, yeah, I just jumped in.
Oh, that's okay. Better late than never. Happy to have you. All right. All you missed was coral reefs and sea anemones and a review. That was about it. So not too bad. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, hey, timekeeper, what time are we at here, Tanner? Got to get him in my chat box here. I don't want to fall behind on that deal. Okay. So 2:20. Thanks, Tanner. Okay, perfect. So let's talk worms. Worms are normally what we do for a dissection, which you'd think like, man, there's nothing in a worm. You kids who have gone fishing, you're like, I've pinched a worm in half. There's nothing in there. Believe me, there's a brain, there's hearts, there's intestines, blood, teeny, 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 tiny kidneys. There's all sorts of things inside a worm, but that'll be kind of tough to do over digital schooling. I'll figure out a way, a YouTube video or something I can make where we can do it. But let's talk about worms, because worms are kind of tricky. They're not just what you see when you go fishing. Those are actually an invasive species. Most native worms are a whole lot smaller than that, but there's all sorts of worms. There's flat worms, there's round worms, there's many different species, and there's worms that live in dogs, worms that live in sheep, and they've all got different types of nutrition, but there's a lot of overlap, especially in their body plans and their reproductive strategies. And so that's what we're going to kind of talk about is what's the general body plan of these worms. It might surprise you to learn that worms are bilaterally symmetrical. That's a weird thing to think about because like even our cartoon worm, like he's a circle, right? He's a tube. These guys look circular. So if you were to guess, you'd probably say, well, they have radial symmetry. Like if I stood a worm up head to butt, I'd have a circle. You could look down a circle and he would be circular, right? Like a PVC tube. Well, they're not like a PVC tube. Believe it or not, an earthworm has a belly, a back, and a left and right side, and he's bilaterally symmetrical. It's craziest thing, but they do have a left and a right side. So the worms do have a head. They have an anterior region. Does anybody know the word anterior already? Getting a lot of blank looks. Okay, anterior means front, posterior means back. And so worms do have a front and a back. Now this guy's a little exaggerated. They don't have eyes and teeth and nervous eyebrows and that kind of stuff, but they do have most of their sensory organs are right up in the front of that worm. And this is a process called cephalization. Cephalo means head. So cephalization is like the process of essentially having a head. So right at the top of this worm, there's going to be a bundle of neurons. It's not huge. It's not really big enough to even call a brain, but we have a special term for a little bundle of neurons we call ganglia. So they have a central ganglion, which is a little chunk of white nerves. Like it's not microscopic. You can literally see it and pick it out with scissors and be like, look, there's a worm brain. So they have pretty much all of their nervous system is regulated in their head. They have a mouth at their head. They also have 5 pairs of aortic arches and a central heart right behind their brain. So in the first like inch of this worm, let's say this is a big night crawler for fishing, right? The whole back is intestines. And in that first little inch is a mouth, a brain, and most of his circulatory system, which is pretty cool. The thing that they're not going to have is lungs or gills, which is kind of weird. Mitch, what do you think? You got a question. I'm sorry, sir. What's your question?
How come you can cut them in half then?
It's one of my favorite questions, right? The question's always like, well, if you earthworms, this is how the urban legend works, right? Earthworms have 6 hearts. Okay. So if you cut them into 6 pieces, you can have 6 different worms. Some you can, some you can't. Little tiny flatworms, which you and I don't deal with and you and I don't go fishing with, those guys you can cut in half and they will regenerate. But an earthworm has one big artery running right down his body, okay? And then one vein coming back to his heart. So you pinch a worm in half and he's going to be bleeding out, no different than cutting any other animal in half. He's not going to regenerate, regrow a head or anything like that. He's going to bleed to death. Just like any other animal, he will try to vasoconstrict to limit his blood loss. If he can do that and clot the blood, and you left the head on, you might have half a worm, a shorter version who's still hanging around. He's still got a mouth, he's still got a brain, he's still got a heart. But if you take the posterior end, the worm butt, and throw that in your bucket, that thing's going to die. It's got no brain, it's got no mouth, it's got no means of acquiring nutrition. I think most folks kind of lose track of them because we have one little pail of worms for all of our fishing and we just kind of throw them in there. But I think if a guy were to test it out, you'd end up just having a dead worm because they bleed out like any other critter would. So that's a good question. All right. Any other questions about worms? Because I just had a question for you guys. This is a tough one. You ready? Worms have no lungs. Worms have no gills. But respiration is a requirement for life. So how do you think worms breathe?
Don't they breathe through their skin or something?
Ooh, got it. Good answer. They do. They breathe through their skin. So you and I have little tiny blood vessels called capillaries. Those capillaries go to our lungs. We take a deep breath, and the oxygen touches the capillary and gets into our blood as our blood flows around. So worms do the same thing without lungs. Our lungs are a moist medium for that oxygen to be in. Well, worms' environments are pretty moist as well. And so what they do is they just pump their blood, if this is their skin, they pump their blood right up next to their skin and let that oxygen diffuse in through their skin, which is cool because one of the things that's crazy about worms is those things can live a long time in water. They can respire through water just like they can respire through air and the dirt, which I never knew as a kid because I was always told when it rains, worms come out because they're drowning. They leave their holes at night after a rainstorm because their holes are flooded. But then you see them in a puddle, submerged, 5 hours later, and they're moving. And you're like, well, what the heck, dude? Why haven't you drowned? Because they can breathe in the water too. There's oxygen dissolved in water too. So it's a crazy, crazy thing. But that's worms. They're a weird little critter. Okay.
So why do they come up from their holes when it's raining anyways?
Oh, it's a great question. My kids and I just watched a Wild Kratts episode on that same question, and it was a tough one. And I was really excited because I never knew the answer. And at the end of the Wild Kratts the end of the show, they didn't know the answer either. I was like, "Come on, Wild Kratts, what are you doing?" But no, it's a great question, Thomas. Couple of answers, but oh, I got to put this on YouTube. I'm so embarrassed. Dang it. Okay. Well, too late. We're going there. First off, you have to understand the long, long line of redneckery that I come from to appreciate this. But back when Mr. Stecker was just a little guy in New Underwood, I would get up real late at night, about 12:30, 1 a.m. after a rainstorm, grab a flashlight, get my little brother up, and we'd go out worm hunting. They sold them at the bait shop. Worms are everywhere after a rainstorm, everywhere. You sneak around in the ditches like a weirdo, real slow with your flashlight, and you find worms, and you snatch them up, and you pull real gentle so they don't break, and then you sell them to the bait shop. It's a good old time. And so, anyways, and so all the time, we'd get a 2-for-1, right? Where there's a worm and another worm. They're stuck together. So you got to put the flashlight on them, sneak up, snatch them. And you got your second hand down, then you got to kind of work them out of their 2 different holes, right? So why do worms come out after a rainstorm? Well, they got to have a moist environment to survive in because they respire through their skin. And there's several advantages to rainstorm. They're not going to drown in their holes, but they do eat organic material. Most organic material, dead leaves and grass and that kind of stuff, is up at the surface. It's not a foot down there. It's up at the surface. That's where you want to be. After rainstorms, a real good time to come out because the ground is moist and you can respire through your skin. And also, there are very few predators. 6 a.m. when the sun is shining is a downright terrible time to come out of the ground for a worm because robins will kill you and eat you. But in the nighttime after a rainstorm, there's not a whole lot going on except for a couple little redneck kids running around with their flashlights. It's a pretty safe time to come out and be a worm. But what do you suppose those two worms are doing that were stuck to each other? You know what it is. It's making worm babies. That's a 2-for-1 worm baby catch, right? Which is kind of gross to think about that. Like, man, that's gross. But, whatever. Caught 2 worms. So that's the advantage of coming out at night after the rainstorm. They show up, they reproduce, they both go down to their little separate holes with their fertilized eggs and drop them in the holes and cruise away and live their worm life. All worms are naturally functioning hermaphrodites, if you were curious. There are no boy worms or girl worms. They're both, if that makes sense. But you can't fertilize your own eggs with your own sperm, or you defeat the purpose of genetic diversity and sexual reproduction. So you have to come out of your little hole after the rainstorm, sexually reproduce with another worm, crawl back down the hole, let the eggs get fertilized, drop them in the dirt in the tunnel that you made, and cruise along eating little chunks of grass and stuff until, you're caught by a robin or something. Kind of a sad life when you think of it that way, I guess. Well, maybe there's some deeper thought there that a worm has. I doubt it. Aubrey, what do you think?
Okay, so if a worm is both, then can they each fertilize each other's eggs and then both have kids?
That's exactly what they do.
Oh, okay.
Fantastic thought. And yes, yeah, one sperm from one worm goes to the other worm's eggs, and that worm's sperm goes to the other worm's eggs. So it's a swap. And then they're out of there. And then they both have fertilized eggs and genetic diversity, unless you catch them. So, anyways, Tanner, my timekeeper, says it is 2:30, and now you guys all have an even greater respect for just the ridiculously redneck childhood I came from. But, good times. Fishing's still fun. Okay, so dare I ask any questions about worms or sea anemones or corals or invertebrate body plans or anything like that? Going once, going twice?
I got a
Teachers?
question about worms.
Okay, Mitchell, hit me with your question about worms.
So when they reproduce, do they have a hole or something? Or do they just go through skin?
Such a good question. They do have holes. So many holes. It's confusing and almost microscopic. We will go over that next time. There's a little structure called a clitellum with a groove down the clitellum that goes to a pore that holds the sperm for later. And so, yeah, there's a whole complex acquisition, transport, and storage system for both worms. So, yeah, good question. Any other questions?